A milk truck? Everybody knows it's gotta be a logging truck when you're in Maine. Or maybe in Orinoco. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. As part of my 2020 13 Nights of Halloween series, today I'm going to be talking about the 1983 sci-fi drama, The Dead Zone. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, ranked lists, and trailer reactions. All of my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. The Dead Zone stars Christopher Walken, Brooke and Martin Sheen, and was directed by David Cronenberg. Based on Stephen King's 1979 novel of the same name, it tells the story of Johnny Smith, played by Christopher Walken, who awakens from a coma 5 years after an accident to find that he has psychic powers. The Dead Zone was the first non-horror Stephen King book I read. This was back in my junior high Stephen King reading marathon days when I had just discovered him. And at the time, I didn't realize that he wrote non-horror occasionally, so I was a bit surprised by this one. With a name like The Dead Zone, I was reading it waiting for the inevitable horror to kick in, and before I knew it, I had finished the book. And even though it wasn't what I had expected at all, I really enjoyed the premise and the surprising directions it took. So after finishing the book, I watched the movie for the first time, and was really underwhelmed by it. Of all my Stephen King rewatches this month, this is the one that had the longest period of time between rewatches. In fact, the last time I had watched this movie in its entirety was that first time, right after finishing the book 16 years ago. I guess it was partly because I wasn't really taken with it, but honestly, it's mostly because this film still hasn't gotten a standalone Blu-ray release for whatever reason. Anyway, I went into this rewatch hopeful, because I found that my opinions changed some on a few of these adaptations, but apparently not on this one. This movie's biggest strength comes directly from the source material, and that's the premise. The idea that a guy suffers traumatic brain damage and gains clairvoyance as a result is so interesting. He's able to use these powers to learn about past events, but they can also give him precognitive abilities too. And just that concept allows for so many possibilities, many of which are explored here. I think the movie does a decent job handling Johnny's visions. The first one is admittedly a little goofy looking, but the rest are pretty good. I especially like his looks to the past, and his brief time hunting the Castle Rock Killer is probably my favorite part of the movie. Unfortunately, a cool premise alone isn't enough to drive this film. Like so many of the other underwhelming Stephen King adaptations, The Dead Zone isn't a particularly plot-driven story. It certainly has its important events, but a lot of the focus is on Johnny and his struggles, both related to his powers and to his personal life, having just found out that he lost 5 years of time and basically everything that he once knew. And I'll give this film credit for understanding that. It doesn't try to shove through a plot-only story to us. There's a concerted effort to convey Johnny's personal struggles, but the internal monologue quality of those from the book are really difficult to capture in a movie. And so the character aspects of this story ring extremely emotionally hollow here as a result. It's certainly supposed to be a darkly emotional tale, but the first act of this movie plays out as almost pure melodrama. It just feels very unnatural, and with a lot of stilted dialogue, it's tough to buy into the relationship or into Johnny's post-coma life. It all has a made-for-TV, borderline soap opera-y feel in between all the science fiction, which is unfortunate because that character aspect of the story is really important for understanding the decisions that Johnny makes regarding his powers. And without believable emotion, it hampers the plot points of the story as well. I mentioned earlier that I like the past-looking side of Johnny's powers, but the precognition element is especially interesting as it relates to the third act of the film. The whole political subplot does feel a bit rushed in the movie compared to the book, but it's taken on an eerily prescient feel now. Martin Sheen's performance here as Greg Stilson is probably the best in the film, possibly because of how blunt the character is. There's not really any nuance there, so he doesn't fall into the melodrama trappings that the other characters do. The first time I saw this movie, Stilson seemed almost like a caricature. He was so corrupt and so over the top that it felt almost silly in its exaggerated politician portrayal. Let's just say that rewatching it now, Stilson doesn't seem like such a far-fetched character. And so after rewatching this movie for the first time in a decade and a half, I'm still pretty mixed on it. I love the premise, but I don't think it does a very good job delivering the emotional, character-driven components of the story. And to be honest, from a film standpoint, there's nothing particularly memorable about this movie to make it stand out. I mean, I know the story itself isn't meant to be flashy, but this film is pretty styleless, which is crazy when you realize that this was directed by David Cronenberg. Yeah, that David Cronenberg. But unlike Brian De Palma and John Carpenter, who were able to inject their own styles into Carrie and Christine respectively, to varying degrees of success, this is a Cronenberg film that's all but unrecognizable as Cronenberg. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The only real pro here is the premise. And I guess it's debatable if I can even credit that to the movie, since it's all due to Stephen King's source material. But it's a very cool concept. Just the sheer number of things that could be done and shown with this touch-based clairvoyance idea is really impressive. The movie only touches on a handful of Johnny's visions, but I think it does a good job of showcasing the detective qualities of his past-looking visions, like with the Castle Rock killer, as well as his future-looking precognition, like with Stilson. On the con side, the biggest issue is how emotionally hollow this movie feels. In spite of the sci-fi elements, this is a story that really heavily relies on some pretty dark and downbeat emotion to progress the story. It's very much focused on Johnny struggling to not only accept that he's lost 5 years of his life, but that he now has this power and can't decide whether it's a gift or a curse. Unfortunately, all of those emotional components come across really melodramatic here. It all feels so unnatural and hollow, so it makes it hard to buy into these characters, which has an impact on how the plot plays out too. Along similar lines, con number 2 has to do with the pacing. This is the kind of story that needs some setup on the front end, so the first act being a bit on the slow side is understandable. The problem really comes from the rushed nature of the main plot points in the second and especially the third act. So much time is spent on the disappointingly delivered emotional drama that the actual dead zone stuff takes a backseat for the majority of the movie. So that political focal point that's weaved throughout the novel just feels really sudden here in the movie. It's like the third act was an afterthought and just tacked on as the final 10 or 15 minutes after an incredibly long, dragged out second act. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying The Dead Zone or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give The Dead Zone 3 out of 5 paws. I'm really conflicted on this one. I really like the premise and think it's got some decent performances, but the melodrama is almost overpowering at times. I thought that maybe I wasn't a huge fan of this one the first time because of the changes from the novel, but I can see now that the issues run a bit deeper than that. I would recommend The Dead Zone to people interested in Stephen King, but not horror. This is a sci-fi drama with a really cool concept and only one scene that sorta borders on horror. It's got some issues, but if you like Christopher Walken, Martin Sheen, or Brooke Adams, you'll probably enjoy this for their performances. If you're a fan of the book, I think this is a movie that could go either way for you. Seeing the Dead Zone clairvoyance put into action could be enjoyable enough to pull it up for you, or the emotional hollowness and melodrama could be enough to drag it down for you. If you like The Dead Zone, I would recommend The Manchurian Candidate, either the 1962 original or the 2004 remake. It also has a story that involves manipulation and visions of sorts, as well as a potentially damaging political candidate. If you like the partial Castle Rock setting, you might want to watch Needful Things. It's another Stephen King adaptation that features a character who can sense things about people, and is another film that stumbles a bit due to difficulty with a character-forward story. And if you're interested in another David Cronenberg film that doesn't quite feel like a typical Cronenberg film, I'd suggest you check out A History of Violence. It's a bit of a mysterious drama thriller that has some good character work as well as some surprisingly violent action. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen The Dead Zone? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite movie featuring a character who can see the future? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, This has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.